The hall was silent. Not the kind of silence born from politeness, but the kind that precedes a storm. Rows of diplomats sat frozen beneath the golden emblem of the United Nations, their eyes fixed on the lone figure walking toward the podium. Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, didn't glance sideways. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. He adjusted the microphone. Then, with a voice that sliced through the marble air like a blade, he declared, "Africa will no longer be your pawn." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Netanyahu, seated 3 rows back, stiffened. His fingers curled around the edge of his folder. A whisper passed between the French and German delegates. The Kenyan ambassador leaned forward, eyes wide. Traoré didn't flinch. He scanned the room, his gaze steady, unshaken. "For decades," he continued, "we have been lectured, indebted, manipulated. You speak of democracy while funding dictators. You speak of peace while arming warlords. You speak of partnership, but only when it serves your interests." The camera caught Netanyahu's face, tight-lipped, unreadable. But the tension was visible. The room had shifted. Traoré leaned in. "We are not naive. We are not silent. And today, we are not afraid." A murmur rose. Phones lit up. Journalists scrambled to tweet. The hashtag Traoré Speaks began trending before he'd even finished his sentence. Then came the line that would echo across continents. "If you insult our dignity again, you will hear from every corner of Africa." The room held its breath. Netanyahu blinked. The world watched. But what Traoré said next would ignite a firestorm across continents. The insult hadn't come from a battlefield. It came from a boardroom. Leaked transcripts from the G7 summit revealed Netanyahu's offhand remark. "African leaders are sentimental. They don't understand power." It was said with a smirk, dismissed with a chuckle, and carried across continents like a slap. For many, it was just another whisper in the corridors of global diplomacy. But for Ibrahim Traoré, it was a line in the sand. The timing couldn't have been more volatile. The IMF had just tightened its grip on Burkina Faso's debt restructuring. Western diplomats were circling, pushing for compliance, offering aid with strings attached. And across Africa, leaders were being nudged, quietly, forcefully, toward alignment with Western interests. But Traoré wasn't interested in playing the game. "This is not about me," he said, voice steady, eyes locked on the assembly. "This is about every African child who's been told their dreams are too big. Every farmer who's been priced out of their own soil. Every leader who's been asked to bow before they speak." The room shifted. Delegates leaned in. The insult had awakened something deeper, something older. He continued, "When Netanyahu mocks our intelligence, he mocks our history. He mocks our ancestors who resisted colonization. He mocks our youth who build futures with nothing but grit." It wasn't just a speech, it was a reckoning. Traoré invoked the names of Sankara, Lumumba, Nkrumah. He spoke of sovereignty not as a slogan, but as a birthright. "We are not sentimental. We are strategic. And we are done being underestimated." The tension was palpable. Netanyahu remained silent, his expression unreadable. But the message was clear. The days of quiet compliance were over. Traoré's voice dropped, almost to a whisper. "You have 48 hours to retract your words. To apologize, not to me, but to Africa." Gasps. Murmurs. A ripple of disbelief. "And if you don't," he said, "we will show you what unity looks like." And then came the ultimatum. A 48-hour warning that stunned the diplomatic world. Benjamin Netanyahu has always played the game of power with precision. For decades, he stood at the center of global diplomacy, a figure both revered and reviled. His legacy is carved into the headlines: military campaigns in Gaza, icy standoffs with the UN, and a relentless pursuit of Western alliances that shield him from scrutiny. To his supporters, he's a master strategist. To his critics, he's a symbol of unchecked arrogance. At the G7 summit, behind closed doors and away from cameras, Netanyahu reportedly leaned back in his chair and delivered a line that would echo far beyond the room. "African leaders are naive. They don't understand power." It wasn't just a comment. It was a worldview, one that saw Africa not as a partner, but as a pawn, one that dismissed centuries of resistance, resilience, and rebirth with a single sentence. The leak hit the wires like a lightning bolt. African diplomats were stunned. Social media erupted. But Netanyahu didn't flinch. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He simply moved on, calculating, dismissive, untouchable. This wasn't new. Netanyahu's playbook has long relied on Western favoritism. When Gaza burned, he stood before cameras and spoke of defense. When UN resolutions condemned settlements, he waved them off as bias. And when African nations sought trade equity, he offered lectures instead of deals. Behind the scenes, the IMF tightened its grip on African economies. Loans came with conditions. Conditions came with silence. And silence came with suffering. Netanyahu knew this. He counted on it. His alliances were strategic. Washington, London, Paris, all lined up behind him. He spoke their language. He echoed their fears. And in return, they gave him cover. But what he didn't count on was Ibrahim Traoré. Traoré wasn't groomed in elite diplomatic circles. He didn't come from a legacy of political dynasties. He came from the barracks, from the soil, from the streets of Ouagadougou where promises were broken and futures were stolen. And he had no intention of playing Netanyahu's game. When Traoré stepped onto the UN stage, he wasn't just confronting a man. He was confronting a system that had allowed Netanyahu to mock, maneuver, and manipulate without consequence. Netanyahu watched from his seat, expression unreadable. But beneath the surface, the tension was real. This wasn't a routine speech. This was a challenge. Traoré's words weren't diplomatic. They were defiant. You speak of peace while funding war, he said. You speak of partnership while mocking our intelligence. The room shifted. The power dynamic cracked. Netanyahu had built his legacy on dominance, on being the smartest man in the room. But now, the room was listening to someone else. And Traoré wasn't just reacting. He was ready to rewrite the rules. Before the world knew his name, Ibrahim Traoré was just another soldier in fatigues, boots caked in dust, eyes trained on a horizon that rarely promised change. He didn't inherit power. He earned it, one decision at a time, in a country where promises were currency and betrayal was tradition. Burkina Faso had been bleeding, bled by corruption, by foreign interests, by leaders who spoke of sovereignty while signing away the soil. Traoré didn't wait for permission. He stepped into the void. His first move was seismic, nationalizing the gold mines. No longer would foreign companies extract wealth while locals starved. Our gold will feed our children, he declared. And it did. Revenues surged. Schools reopened. Roads were paved. Then came the tractors, hundreds of them, distributed to farmers who had tilled land with bare hands for generations. It wasn't just machinery, it was dignity. We will not beg for bread when we can grow it ourselves, he said. Youth followed him, not because he promised miracles, but because he listened. He walked through villages without an entourage. He sat with students, not donors. He spoke in the language of the people, not the language of diplomats. And when the West raised eyebrows, he didn't flinch. He cut ties with exploitative aid packages. He rejected IMF conditions that strangled growth. He chose sovereignty over comfort. Traoré's rise wasn't polished. It was raw. It was real. From the barracks to the presidential palace, he carried the weight of a continent's frustration and its hope. So when he stood before the UN, he didn't come for applause. He came for justice. He looked out at the sea of suits and flags and said, I am not here to be tolerated. I am here to be heard. The room didn't know how to respond. Because Traoré wasn't just speaking for Burkina Faso. He was speaking for every nation that had been patronized, every leader who had been mocked, every citizen who had been silenced. And that's why his next words hit harder than any missile. The air inside the UN chamber had thickened. Netanyahu shifted in his seat, the subtle twitch of his jaw betraying the discomfort he refused to show. Traoré stood firm, his posture unyielding, his voice now sharper, colder. You speak of peace, he said, eyes locked on Netanyahu, while funding war. A gasp rippled through the assembly. The phrase wasn't just provocative, it was surgical. It sliced through diplomatic pleasantries and exposed the raw nerve beneath. You condemn violence in press releases, Traoré continued, but your weapons cross borders in silence. You call for restraint, yet your allies drop bombs with impunity. Cameras flashed. Journalists leaned forward. The Israeli delegation whispered among themselves, visibly rattled. Netanyahu's fingers tapped the table, slow, deliberate, like a man calculating his next move. Traoré didn't wait. You mock our intelligence, but it is your hypocrisy that insults the world. You call African leaders naive, Yet it is we who bury the dead when your policies ignite conflict. It is we who rebuild with nothing while you profit from destruction. The room was no longer neutral. Delegates from South Africa, Senegal, and Egypt nodded subtly. The balance was shifting, not just in words, but in energy. Netanyahu's silence was deafening. He had mastered the art of deflection, but this was different. This wasn't a press conference. This was a reckoning. Traoré's voice rose, not in anger, but in clarity. You speak of democracy while silencing dissent. You speak of justice while shielding war criminals. You speak of partnership while treating us as pawns. The French ambassador lowered his gaze. The German delegate scribbled notes. The American representative sat motionless, lips pursed. Traoré paused. The silence begged for breath. Then he said, Africa is not your chessboard, and I am not your piece. The words hung in the air like thunder before the strike. Netanyahu's face hardened, but he didn't speak, because the Real explosion was yet to come. Traoré stood motionless, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the room ache. Then, with a calm that felt almost surgical, he leaned into the microphone and delivered the line that would ricochet across continents. Apologize to Africa within 48 hours, or face diplomatic isolation. The chamber erupted, not in noise, but in tension. Delegates shifted. Journalists scrambled. Netanyahu's face tightened, his jaw locked in place. The Israeli delegation whispered urgently, but Traoré didn't flinch. He continued, voice unwavering. We have seen the transcripts. We have heard the mockery. We know what was said behind closed doors at the G7. You called us naive. You laughed at our sovereignty. You dismissed our intelligence. He paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle. But what you fail to understand is this. Africa is no longer listening. Africa is speaking. He reached into his folder and pulled out a printed page. Highlighted, annotated, unmistakable. This, he said, holding it up, is your voice. Your words. Your contempt. The document was a leaked G7 briefing, circulated quietly among diplomats, but never meant for public eyes. It contained Netanyahu's alleged remarks, IMF strategy notes, and a chilling line. Pressure African states through debt leverage. Keep them compliant. Traoré didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply read. Debt is not diplomacy. Exploitation is not partnership. And silence is no longer our strategy. The room was electric. Delegates from South Africa and Kenya exchanged glances. The Nigerian ambassador nodded slowly. The Ghanaian representative tapped his phone, already composing a tweet. Traoré pressed on. You speak of global cooperation while weaponizing our poverty. You speak of peace while funding chaos. You speak of equality while mocking our leaders. He turned toward Netanyahu. You may sit behind alliances. You may hide behind vetoes. But you cannot hide from truth. Then came the pivot, the moment that transformed the speech from confrontation to revolution. Traoré looked directly into the camera broadcasting live across the globe. To every African youth watching this, you are not naive. You are not invisible. You are the architects of a continent that will no longer be defined by others. Phones lit up. Screens flashed. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag Africa is not your pawn. Hashtag Traoré speaks. Hashtag dignity over debt. South Africa's foreign ministry reposted the clip within minutes. Kenya's president tweeted, Africa stands tall today. Influencers, activists, and artists joined the chorus. The speech wasn't just trending, it was transforming. Netanyahu's face remained stone, but the cracks were visible. His usual confidence had been replaced by calculation. He whispered to an aide, who scribbled furiously. Traoré wasn't done. We are not asking for favors. We are demanding respect. And if that respect is not given, we will withdraw it from you. He listed the consequences: diplomatic boycotts, trade freezes, UN voting blocks. You will find yourself speaking to empty chairs. You will find your embassies quiet. You will find your influence fading. The threat wasn't theatrical, it was strategic. Traoré had coordinated with a coalition of African nations. The ultimatum was real. You have 48 hours, he repeated. Not to save face, but to face truth. The room was still, the kind of stillness that precedes history. Traoré stepped back from the podium. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply nodded once, turned, and walked away. The applause didn't come immediately. It came in waves, first from the African bloc, then from Latin American delegates. then from scattered voices across Europe. It wasn't polite. It was powerful. Netanyahu remained seated, unmoving. But the message had landed. Outside the UN, crowds gathered. Screens replayed the speech on loop. Commentators called it the most defiant moment in modern African diplomacy. Celebrities posted clips with captions like, "Finally, a voice that speaks for us." And in the heart of Ouagadougou, young people danced in the streets. But the ripple effect was just beginning. The moment Traoré stepped away from the podium, the world didn't just react. It roared. Within minutes, social media platforms lit up like wildfire. The clip of his speech, his voice steady, his warning clear, was reposted by millions. Memes flooded timelines. Traoré standing tall with captions like, "Africa's lion has spoken, and not your pawn." TikTok creators remixed his words with beats, turning defiance into anthem. Hashtags surged. Hashtag Africa is not your pawn. Hashtag Traoré speaks. Hashtag dignity over debt. But it wasn't just digital noise. It was a movement. In Nairobi, students marched with banners quoting Traoré's ultimatum. In Accra, murals appeared overnight, depicting him as a modern Sankara. In Johannesburg, youth leaders held vigils, calling for a new era of African diplomacy. Celebrities joined in. Burna Boy tweeted, "This is the energy we need." Lupita Nyong'o reposted the speech with the caption, "History is being made." Trevor Noah dedicated a segment to the moment, calling it the most unapologetic clapback in UN history. Even outside Africa, the ripple was felt. Latin American activists drew parallels to their own struggles. Caribbean leaders praised the stance. Diaspora communities in Paris, London, and New York organized solidarity rallies. And then came the numbers. Afrobarometer released a flash poll just 48 hours after the speech. Approval ratings for Traoré had skyrocketed. 72% of respondents across 15 African nations said they felt pride in his message. 64% said they believed Africa was entering a new diplomatic era. The youth demographic, ages 18 to 35, showed the highest surge in support. Commentators scrambled to catch up. Some called it a continental awakening. Others labeled it the most significant African-led diplomatic moment since the non-aligned movement. But for the people, it wasn't about labels. It was about voice. Traoré had spoken not just to Netanyahu, but to every system that had dismissed, exploited, or ignored Africa's dignity. And the final message? It wasn't just for Netanyahu. The dust of diplomacy had barely settled, but Traoré wasn't finished. He returned to the podium, not for rebuttal, not for applause, but for clarity. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of centuries. "You called us naive," he said, eyes scanning the chamber. "But let me tell you what naivety is. Naivety is believing Africa will remain silent forever. Naivety is mistaking humility for weakness. Naivety is thinking we do not see the strings behind your smiles." He paused, letting the words breathe. "We are not naive," he continued. "We are rising." The phrase echoed like a drumbeat. Delegates leaned in. Viewers at home sat up. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a redefinition. Traoré spoke of unity, not as a dream, but as a strategy. "We are 1.4 billion voices. We are 54 nations. We are the minerals beneath your machines, the labor behind your luxuries, the culture you imitate but rarely credit." He didn't speak in anger. He spoke in truth. We are done being divided by borders drawn in colonial ink. We are done being measured by GDP while our children starve. We are done being told to wait our turn. The chamber was silent, not out of politeness, but out of reckoning. Traoré turned toward the African bloc. "Let this be the moment history remembers. Not when we were mocked, but when we stood tall. When we chose dignity over debt. When we chose unity over silence." He invoked the names of those who came before: Sankara, Nyerere, Mandela. They lit the torch. We carry it now. Then, he looked directly into the camera. "To every African child watching this, you are not a footnote. You are the headline. You are not the future. You are the present." The emotional crescendo was undeniable. Delegates wiped tears. Journalists stopped typing. The room wasn't just witnessing a speech, it was witnessing a shift. Traoré closed with a challenge. "To the world, treat us as equals, or prepare to stand alone. To Africa, speak boldly, act bravely, and never again apologize for your pride. He stepped back, not with triumph, but with purpose. And if you're watching this, you're part of that story. Traoré didn't just shock the UN, he awakened the world. In a single speech, he shattered the illusion of quiet compliance and lit a fire that spread from diplomatic chambers to city streets. His words weren't just defiance, they were a declaration. A call to every person who's ever felt dismissed, underestimated, or silenced. This wasn't about Burkina Faso alone. It was about every nation that's been told to wait its turn. Every voice that's been told it's too bold. Every people who've been told they're too proud. And now, the world listens differently. If you felt something stir while watching this, pride, anger, hope, then this story is yours too. Because dignity isn't a luxury. It's a right. And when one voice rises, it gives others permission to rise with it. So don't let this moment fade. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video. Be part of the movement that refuses to be spoken for. Because Traoré spoke for Africa, but he also spoke for you. And history doesn't wait. It listens to those who speak loudest, stand tallest, and refuse to be ignored.